Why don't we call this to order? I don't think we're anticipating Councilmember Smith joining us, so why don't we get started?
Okay, item number 1 is a City Controller report relative to the payments to Express Environmental Corporation for wastewater pumping and disposal.
And do we have folks from the Controller's office or the Controller herself that would like to make a presentation?
Hello, how are you?
Welcome.
It's a low chair. Sorry about that. It fell back.
Well, the other one looks better if you want to.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'll sit up straight here. So, good morning or good afternoon, Mr. Parks, too. Mr. Koretz, thank you. Colleagues, thank you for having me today. And I have a staff representative here today from the Controller's office that can answer a lot of the questions you may have. But being this one of my early audits that have been released, I feel like I almost know it word for word, but not as good as my staff that are here today. This is particularly, of course, on Express Environmental Corporation and payments for their wastewater pumping and disposal. The Department of General Services was the contract administrator with the Bureau of Street Services as the primary user of this contract. The city held this contract for 7 years, and it was about $12.9 million had been paid over that period of time. What our audit found was a number of things. The first is, I think, a poorly written contract, lack of oversight, and which potentially could have saved the city millions of dollars. Some of the findings include that the city was overbilled by nearly $1 million by Express for the amount of wastewater actually delivered to the independent facility for disposal, and that there was not clear oversight as to see the difference between what was they said was taken from that facility and then ultimately given to the third party. If we had negotiated the contract differently, it would have, in our estimation, been about a $6.2 million savings. Our rates for the removal of the wastewater ranged from about 35 cents to $1.35 based on the number of gallons being picked up, when another local agency had negotiated recently a flat rate of 33 cents per gallon. We believe that there is a way in which to, again, reduce the cost to the city of Los Angeles and not being charged that higher rate. When we believe as well that at times when the contractor could have brought a larger truck for a reduced cost, there were the smaller trucks and we were paying double and triple the cost we felt were necessary on that day. And again, looking at the oversight by the departments to be able to monitor that. I think the audit highlights something that I know we all are familiar with, which is weaknesses in the city's contracting process as to who is ultimately responsible in getting the best deal. GSD is our procurement officer, which has a responsibility of being the lead on many of the city contracts. However, GSD doesn't always have the technical expertise and relies on the departments for some of their subject matter review, but they also don't necessarily have the expertise in that contract negotiation. And so we think there needs to be a greater coordination between both departments, GSD, and whether in this instance Street Services or other departments as well. We have been working with the city attorney and GSD and the Bureau of Street Services to seek reimbursement of the $1 million that was overcharged for the disposal of the wastewater. Fortunately, the department has ended the contract with Express and uses now a different company called Clean Harbor, but their contract with Clean Harbor is the same that we had with Express. And so the department probably could respond today as well as looking at potentially renegotiating that Clean Harbor contract. For me, I think as we look at the economic times, and both of you on budget committee, the importance of every $1,000 to $1 million here and there makes a big difference to the city of Los Angeles. This issue came to us, the audit of this particular came to our waste, fraud, and abuse unit in the city of Los Angeles. This unit, I think, is always well worth the dollars that we invest, as small as it is, to be able to find that $1 million. It's paid for itself over the time. And it came, again, through someone who called the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse unit as well. I know that you have another item on the agenda today following this. I think it's item 2 that is talking about strengthening the waste, fraud, and abuse unit. We are working closely and having some discussions with the City Attorney's Office and others to be able to work out some of the challenges. As Pete Etcheria can tell you, and as one of the authors of the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Unit through the City Council, it's sometimes a lot of negotiation to make sure that, one, you're doing things within the appropriate law, but two, also ensuring that we look at problems that have occurred in the past and those that we can have best practices going forward. And if we don't know about waste or fraud that's occurred in other departments, we can't use that as a teaching tool, so to speak, with other departments. And so I think that, because I will not be able to stay for that next item, that there's been a request for 30 to 45 days for us to sit down with the City Attorney's Office and others to work out what potentially might allow us to have better control and information sharing between departments when there is some waste, fraud, or abuse in the city of Los Angeles. But thank you, Mr. Kress. I know you stood there with me when we released this audit, and I want to thank the departments and, of course, my staff who worked very diligently for a long period of time to collect this data, which I think is critically important, and will continue to do that. So I'm here to answer any questions. My staff is as well as the departments. Both GSD, I think, and Street Services are here, and we're working very closely with them because, as you know, Mr. Kretz, we've talked about the importance of not just releasing an audit, but seeing it implemented, and appreciate you quickly moving on this one, because if we can renegotiate our contract with Clean Harbor, we could potentially save the city millions of dollars as well going forward.
Now, could you tell us more, if you're allowed to, I don't know, about how we found out about this in the first place? Because it's obviously a great opportunity to save money and catch someone at a practice that they shouldn't have been engaging in.
I want to, those of you who have not met the head of our Waste, Fraud, and Abuse unit, who I'll publicly thank him as well, was responsible for the prestige parking issue that came forward and all of the data collection provided to the City Attorney's Office and others, a real cooperation between Office of Finance, our office, and the City Attorney's Office to have a judgment. I don't know if they've done it's the criminal side that was done on the prestige that we've completed.
Right. I think next week there's actually going to be a restitution hearing for the second part of that.
Yeah, which will hopefully again bring us. So I just want to compliment him publicly. I've told him privately as well for his hard work. But maybe, Brian, if you could share with them our
Sure. Actually, this matter, it originated with the Ethics Commission. Ethics Commission received a whistleblower complaint approximately 2005. The complaint was anonymous, and it actually had some other allegations that were never substantiated by the Ethics Commission. But as they looked into it, they discovered that there might be some anomalies in regards to the actual wastewater. So they had gathered a number of documents, and they started to input it, and eventually they turned it over to us to see if we can evaluate it and discover if there's any consequences in regards to billing issues. And that's kind of how it originated.
And what was the methodology used to calculate the overbilling?
The methodology was basically the company, Express Oil, their goal was to pick up wastewater at city sumps and also city facilities. So there's basically two line items that we looked at. When they would pick it up from city sumps, they would take all of that waste to one disposal facility. That disposal facility, they would actually measure the waste that was brought to them. So they would actually weigh the truck, and they would actually calculate the number of gallons. They would do that conversion themselves. So it's pretty simple for us. We just had to look at how much we were billed by Express and compare it to the information that company gave us. On the second part of it, which were the city facilities, that wastewater went to a different location, which was Southwest is the name of that company. They would do the same thing. It's basically when a truck comes in, they weigh the truck, they determine how much it weighs, all of the waste is disposed of, and then they weigh the truck as it goes out. The difference between the two is the net weight. And there's a simple calculation to take the wastewater in weight and convert it to gallons. We actually used a very conservative method when we did that conversion, because the wastewater that is actually taken from the city facilities, it does have a concentration of solids in there, but we didn't want to make it a more complex calculation, and what we decided to do was just use pure water. So that way it was actually in favor of the contractor. And we made that conversion, got all of the information, and we actually did a sample analysis over the 7 years. And then based on that sample analysis, we came up with our $1 million figure.
And what portion of the total services that the contractor provided were overbilled?
I believe there were anomalies in 75% of the actual invoices. So, I mean, it was a pretty high rate. I mean, initially we did an initial sample over a small period of time, and when we discovered that there was a high percentage of overbillings, that's when we decided to expand it and do a sample over the full 7-year time period. Any other questions for the Controller's Office on this one?
I was just wondering, are they on a no-hire list now?
Not that I know of. I know that there's a contractor ordinance, but I'm not sure. I think that might be a matter for the city attorney's office to address that, and this is still an ongoing matter at this point. So potentially that may be a possibility.
Because we've asked that before, and I think what is fallen apart is that everybody has their own list. There's nothing centralized that says that this person shouldn't be allowed to get an RFP, or this person has done A, B, or C and shouldn't be hired again. And so the other thing I was wondering, from your analysis, was your sense that was this just a blatant fraud, or were there some just errors in how they dealt with issues?
That's a good question. One of the things when you look at fraud, you have to look at whether it was intentional or not. There were overbillings. What they would do is they would actually use a method where they would actually visually more or less measure how much waste they determined that they would take from a truck. So for example, the actual driver, when he extracts waste into his truck, he doesn't have a meter. He does have a meter on there, but it doesn't tell him how many gallons there are. So after he extracts it from a location, what he does is he climbs up on top of the truck, he takes a measuring stick, he puts a stick in there, and he does a visual measurement. Now I know MTA, they do it differently. They don't rely on any visual measurements. They want to see the actual records when you take it to the disposal facility. So that's much more accurate. When you take it to the disposal facility, you have the exact weight, and you can do that calculation. So whether or not it was intentional or not, I don't know at this point. I just know what our analysis shows, that there was a lot of discrepancy.
If we determine this intentional, is that something that goes to the DA or the city attorney?
That's a possibility, right.
And my other question is that we put a lot of time assessing the volume that they picked up versus what they delivered. But what was interesting, it didn't appear that we took any time to figure out what was the actual content, because the person could actually show up every day with a half a load before he got to the city site.
Right. That was another part that I think we addressed that in our report, because you're right, when a truck shows up, I mean, the first thing you'd want to do is you want to be there, you want to make sure that there is actual flow meter on the truck that would show if it was empty. So you would definitely want to verify that the truck was empty, and maybe you don't want to sit there for 2 hours and watch them take all the waste out, but definitely at the end you want to make sure that after they do it, that when they measure it, because a city official actually signs off on that document verifying how much was extracted. So yes, for sure you'd want to have somebody greet them.
It appeared that there was a reluctance to not only sign off after you left, that no one was there to determine whether it was empty.
You're right. That was one of our findings.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, so the issue is, it could be a double hit if they showed up with a half a load of water in their system, because I think you called it content or concentration or something.
Well, actual concentration has to do with the wastewater itself. Like I said, most of the wastewater, it's not pure water, so it has a concentration of solids in there.
But I mean, the issue is if nobody's checking it, that would be some indication if you keep bringing a load of materials that are not with no concentration, it would be apparent that you're just bringing water in and dumping it.
Right.
I mean, so those are things I'm just wondering, do we have an ability to look at both sides of the equation?
And I think one in the department be able, street services may be able to respond to that, because I think they're trying to set up a system where, in fact, there is a check when they literally come to take the wastewater, that there's a better check and balance to address some of the things that Brian found, that there was a signature on it, but they really just signed it without looking. And so I think they may be prepared to respond to that. I know they're going to do that in writing to us as well.
Because that's what I'd like to see, if there's some ability to look at the concentration plus the volume. Otherwise, you could just have people showing up with a tank full of water and charging you for the dumping in the water, and you're not getting service from either angle.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that's a necessary control to have in place.
And that's a question that when we're done with the controller's office, we should ask General Services. And in addition to that, according to the controller's report, Express indicated the city's representative declined to confirm measurements 90% or more of the time. If that's true, how did we verify them, and why did we not verify them much of the time? Those would all be questions for General Services, I guess. Do you have any more questions for the controller? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you very
it.
much.
And
So staff will still be here in case there are any additional questions as you talk to General Services and Street Services.
that would be great. And we'll have questions for them on item number 2 as well. So,
Thank you.
thank you. We could have folks from Street Services and General Services come up and join us. That would be great. And I guess that would be the first question that
First question is actually a question for Street Services, I believe, because General Services does not do the monitoring of the sumps.
Sorry. I'm even shorter than she is, so it's sort of problematical. Could you repeat the question?
Well, my part of the question was the Controller's Office report indicated that according to Express, the city's representative declined to verify anything about these shipments over 90% of the time. Why is that? How were these invoices verified, et cetera? And Councilmember Parks, do you want to restate your part of your question?
Wondering why there's no place or system in place that would not only look at volume, but the concentration of what is being brought to the location. And so it appears that you could be robbed 2 ways.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Dennis Rodgers, Chief Management Analyst, Bureau of Street Services. We weren't involved in the spec of it. We'll start with that. In writing the specification. Our people in the field, the ones that did not sign, it was because they didn't have a way of verifying what had been delivered. As the report explained, we didn't have this verification when they picked things up. It didn't even find out what the actual amount was until they went to the place where they were disposing of these liquids, which is the only time you knew how much it was. So at the point in time when it was picked up, there was not a way frequently for the supervisor to know what had been picked up. In addition, there is no way at the point in time when it's picked up to know what that mix is at all. That's going to be determined at the site which processes it and says, it's 5% oil, it's 10% oil, it's 2% oil. But there was no way for that supervisor to know that when it was picked up. He couldn't tell by looking at it what the percentages of oil to water were, and it changes on a daily basis. Many of the sumps are over near the LA tar pits, and anyone who's been around the city for a while knows there's, depending on the rains, it's gonna change what's occurring there because it's lifting the oils where they're coming down, whatever. But a lot of the supervisors just didn't want to say what was there because they had no way of knowing. The only time you're going to know is when it's delivered to the processing plant, and then you're going to have to match it up with an estimate of what was picked up, because we don't have scales at every location where we can scale it ourselves. And as the controller's office pointed out, they're using a stick to guess. Now, if within the contracts we require that they have flow meters or something else, we might have a better guess, but even at that, you're still not going to know exactly what that percentage of oil to water is until you process it.
So what have we done to use what we learned from this either fraudulent or inaccurate situation to prevent it from happening in the future?
Well, we have stopped using the vendor. We've piggybacked onto a contract that's out of the Bureau of Sanitation, and they've instituted where they're there when the truck is going to arrive at one site. Let's say they only get 500 gallons. They're checked at the first site of the day by the supervisor to make sure they're empty. He's then checking off on approximately how much he thinks is in it. It then arrives to the second site where they will check it again. And because these are manifest loads generally, there's a document that's showing each place it went and how much it put up. So the manifest is sort of our tracking device, but the supervisors along the way will know which yard it's coming to next and what they should more or less find within that truck.
Could you comment on the manifest again and what that does?
Well, it's it's easier if I could show you one, but I'm sorry I did not bring one. I'm sorry. The manifest is a requirement. As with a lot of different types of waste, you're required to have this manifest, and it's showing what every location they went to before they got to the final destination, which is the place that's processing.
Okay, but it shows location, but it doesn't show content or volume that
they're not going to know at that point in time. I mean, it's a great question. I'm sorry, but they're not going to know at that point in time.
Now, what's the status of the effort to recover the overbilled payments?
Well, I guess all of us are sort of working on it. Right now, I have a series of people in our bureau that are going back and collecting all the invoices going back 7 years and the tickets that went with them, and then we're going to see how many or how close we can get to figuring out what we are owed, and we will be bringing that to the city attorney. He will determine how they proceed.
And the differences between the new contractor and the old contractor in terms of the contract itself, are the arrangements different?
The new contract has a lot more detail. They're breaking up how they pay. The other contract was basically on a per gallon cost, where the new one, they're separating out things such as truckload or the truck itself, how much time it was used, and then the gallon is a separate charge. So there's a lot more detail in it.
And are we in the process of trying to change the element in terms of how much we pay at what rate?
Well, I know that the term negotiated was said, but these are not negotiated contracts. I mean, these are bid contracts. I don't know in what instances we would be allowed to negotiate it.
With the purchasing agent contract, it was a competitively bid contract, advertised. We received 5 bids. This is back in 2001 when this contract was bid, and then initiated in 2002. Yeah, there is no room to negotiate these types of contracts. With the current contract, however, it is a professional services contract. It was established by sanitation, and street services is piggybacking that contract. There may be an opportunity or more flexibility to negotiate the structure of that contract within the confines or scope that it was bid by sanitation through an RFP process. The city attorney, I think, would probably have to answer that question.
But we're presumably looking into that.
Well,
it would be street
we are
services.
working with the city attorney's office.
Any other questions?
I was just wondering, evidently we've been doing this for quite a while, well beyond this contract.
The contract actually I researched it back to at least 1996. Again, through a competitive bid process, the same company was awarded the contract because they were the lowest monetary bid. They may have had the contract even prior to 1996. My records don't go back before that. But again, it would have been through a competitive bid process.
I was just wondering if there's an RFP process going on and basically someone is going to be given the contract, does the department look at it at all to determine whether they could actually comply or with the contract, that there's sufficient controls that do not put them in a position, as you mentioned earlier, where they're totally unaware of what's happening and what's being taken or those things? I mean, is that part of the
When a
discussion?
department does an RFP as opposed to general services, generally it's going to be very specific to our business, and yeah, we're going to already know most of those items, like our asphalt contract or something. I mean, it's going to be something that's mission critical to your business when the department does it itself, as opposed to having general services bid it.
I mean, but let me go back a step. If you did this yourself, what would be the additional, are you saying there'd be additional controls?
Well, there may or may not be, depending on what's necessary, but we'd have a lot more knowledge about the issues, about,
Let me respond to this, please. What you're really describing is the rationale as to why the administrative code was changed in the mid-1990s to change the authority of the purchasing agent. The purchasing agent used to have the authority to procure routine services. And because of the problems associated with service contracts, which we're dealing with right now, the ad code was changed to allow the purchasing agent just to procure materials, supplies, and repair of equipment. This contract, part of the problem and lack of good communication is because there was this transition period from making it a purchasing agent contract to a street services, professional services contract.
I don't think you hit my question. What I was concerned about, if you're a department and you're going to get a service, somebody's going to go out to a vendor and get you a service. If there's concerns about you accepting the service and whether you have any idea whether the person is performing the service, then where does that plug in? Does that plug in at the RFP process, saying there's got to be certain guidelines, so when they go to their location that they have some assurance, if we're going to ask them to be there and sign off, that there's assurances they have the ability to do that? Or is there equipment they should have?
Ideally, it's written into the scope of work of the RFP and reinforced in a pre-award meeting and reinforced in whatever supplier performance meetings are held throughout the term of the contract.
Is there equipment they should have that would help them, or does that exist?
Help them to know.
Measure what's in there.
Yeah, I think flow meters were mentioned, but again, that would be, and I think there was mention of certain equipment perhaps at the asphalt plants or at the locations where the material is being picked up, that maybe there are meters or something that could be installed.
Yeah. Obviously, this has happened relatively recently, but yeah, those are things we're starting to look at. Right now, we're focusing on managing the new vendor and making sure that we're getting at least, picked up what there is. But we're going to have people go out to look at the sumps and look at how it does measure it when it comes out. And there may, and I don't know this answer at this point in time, there may be meters that we can independently put so that when it's coming out, we're measuring it and they're measuring it. But I don't know that answer yet.
But I think the issue is that the audit is recent, but if the process hasn't changed, the results may not be recent. It's just that this is the first person that got caught. So I'm just wondering if that's what we're looking at, is ways in which the operating department has access to materials or equipment, so they're not put in a situation where someone comes in, hooks up their truck, leaves, and you have no clue what they just did.
The intent on the Bureau's part is to contact others that are using these services and find out what best management practices currently available for doing that type. But as of today, I do not know that answer. We will include that information when we give our report.
And is this the only places that we use this type of services?
No,
Or are we using it in other city departments?
There is at least one or two other departments. They don't use it as much as us, but perhaps Ken knows which those are.
Wow. I believe there are the fleet services for general services used the service, and I don't recall off the top of my head whether there were other departments, but they would all be using the sanitation contract with Clean Harbors.
So there's one company does the whole city, wherever we may need this.
I believe there's actually two contracts that were issued by sanitation for this purpose, so they may be using one or the other.
And there's also one in the harbor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one speaker from the public, Julie Butcher, representing SEIU 721.
I'm going to sit in the tall chair. So
Good move.
representing SEIU Local 721, I would urge you to ask everybody that could possibly be involved to come back with a plan for how we do this in-house. As it is right now, you are paying a company to steal from you. The city passed a responsible contractor ordinance several years ago that required this kind of itemized, carefully considered, crafted analysis and accountability. Contracts are developed by General Services with complete input from the departments. General Services has actually started to offer training in how to write the specifications to make sure departments get exactly what it is that they need. So to come up and say, we didn't know, we didn't ask for this, I'm sorry, I find that kind of irresponsible and in fact gratuitous. If there are several departments that are using similar services, they should absolutely be done in the most cost-effective way. And so you all should ask a bunch of questions about how to, one, keep this from happening, how to make sure that the city is getting what it is paying for, and holding everybody top to bottom accountable to make sure we're getting the most cost-effective service. So I would, if I were you, ask for a report about how we do this in-house, how to make sure that specifications are actually being written in a way that is maximizing our accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, now we have two other speakers. Actually not. We have one other speaker, Arnold Schwartz. And I'm not clear on whether this is on this item or not. This item number 1.
No.
Okay, so this is just general public comment.
General
Okay, then we'll take you later on. Okay, so we've had our discussion. I would suggest a motion to continue the item for 60 days, instruct street services and general services to transmit their formal audit responses back to the committee within those 60 days. And I would ask that we include in that response to what we will be doing to keep this from happening again, and also consideration of whether we should bring this in-house or not. So that would be the motion I would make, if without objection. Okay, so on to item number 2.
Item number 2 is a motion by Council Members Corretz and Parks relative to the request for the City Attorney to prepare and present an ordinance updating the Administrative Code Section 20.60.4 to strengthen the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Unit in the Office of the City Controller.
Okay, and if we could start with the Controller's Office to give us their thoughts on this.
Ferret Safavid Controller's Office. This is a revision to the ordinance that was previously approved by the council. Currently, Controller is meeting with City Attorney Ethics to go over the changes on the language, and I believe discussion is still continuing.
What's the role of the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Unit? How does an investigation usually unfold, and how does it work?
Well, Fraud and Waste Unit was established about 2 years ago, and the purpose for the unit was to deter, detect, and protect city resources from abuse and misuse. And a unit was established back in 2007. We have investigators of one at this time. We have a system in place that would serve as intake when somebody calls in or somebody wants to report misuse or fraudulent activities. We have a case management. Information is received, analyzed, decided whether we need to conduct investigation to refer it to other city departments for their action. Some of the issues comes to our attention are ethics related. We do not investigate issues of campaign financing, conflict of interest, and so on. Some of the issues are not, in terms of fraudulent activities, requires further audit attention. Those issues are retained within the division for further audit attention. Some of the issues are referred to LAPD, city attorneys, personnel, general managers, depending on the nature of the issues coming in.
And how do you interact in terms of avoiding overlapping authorities with the LAPD and Ethics Commission? And do you ever have multiple investigations, or does it always wind up being just one entity?
We have monthly meetings with Ethics and LAPD to coordinate our investigation activities to make sure that there are no overlapping, duplicate investigation going on. Information are exchanged and discussed with both parties, and we all are aware of who's investigating on what issues. And the meetings, monthly meetings, started about a year and a half or 2 years ago once the original ordinance was approved, and it's been ongoing.
And what does your office see as the most important values in this proposed change to the unit and its processes in terms of getting earlier notification of investigations?
As our controller mentioned earlier, that number one is that we know what are the citywide issues going on in terms of misuse, fraudulent activity. Without having that knowledge, we would not be able to assess and or allocate our resources based on the significant issues going on. That if we have this ordinance change and require the department to report to us, as a repository, we would know we can evaluate a fraud risk assessment, identify where we're going to spend our resources that would have a biggest return for the city. In terms of conducting investigation, it's like audit. You want an audit to be done independent from the department being audited. Same goes with investigation. If we have an investigation initiated by department versus an investigation is being conducted by fraud and rates unit as an independent party, it would have more credibility, more value in terms of the result that you would get. In terms of, we have the expertise. The investigator who was up here, who is a CPA, who's a forensic auditor accountant, we know how to follow the money, basically. We know how to go after waste. It requires certain expertise to conduct investigations, so same as audit. Those are the benefits that other departments would not have, and we would have the resources, although we cannot investigate everything. We don't have the resources. So those are the primary reasons that we are asking for the revision to the language that have them report to us first. We will not investigate every single one of them. We would refer some of them back to the department or most suit, to do the investigation if they have to. But those that requires expertise, we would manage it.
Thank you. Mr. Parks, any other questions for the Controller's Office?
I could understand the whole issue of you being made aware for analysis, but I don't think you could ask the department not to investigate something or to contact you first, because these investigations are not so clinical that they only deal with one aspect. In the middle of one type of investigation, you'll find out other issues or other allegations. So I certainly support the fact that you should be notified, But to tell somebody that because a general manager or a supervisor is in a position to not only, they have to responsibility, if misconduct or criminal activity come to their attention, they can't say time out, I'm gonna call the controller. They're required to take action, and secondarily, they're required to manage the situation and stop whatever the crime. And so I think your request for notification is appropriate. As you look at your resources, you may want to take on a part of that or whatever, but I don't think you can tell a department, don't stop, call us and let us, because nothing is in suspended animation. It's moving constantly. And so I think, it would be a unhealthy response to say, don't do anything until we look at it, because nothing is so clean that it's only going to be that allegation.
Yeah. The revision to the ordinance, the intention is not for department to stop, if the crime is in progress, if somebody's stealing, I do not want the department to call the controller. They ought to call LAPD.
No, I don't mean in progress. I mean, you get investigations where somebody in the midst of talking about something completely contrary can say, and oh, by the way, you should be aware John is doing this, he's that kind of, so the issue is that you don't have the ability to say, I'm going to continue my investigation about allegation 1. I'm going to separate item 2 out and give it to the controller, because it's the fluidness of the investigation is what you're going to be rolling towards. And so it's not a matter of you catch them in the act of stealing. The issue is you're told about things not in a very clinical way, and it's not something that you're going to have a situation where it's always going to be so precise. They're interlinking, the statements are interlinking. You can't separate investigations that cleanly. So again, I would support the fact that you get notified, you're aware that something's going on, and it gives you a chance to monitor, but I don't think you can give a general manager the direction that says, don't do anything until you call me, because your response, as you mentioned today, may be, thanks for the call, but I can't help you.
That's correct.
So I think a simultaneous notification is important, but I think you have to work out the details of who's going to investigate on the fly.
Absolutely,
I don't think you can,
Absolutely, yes. I mean, obviously, we will not be able to investigate every situation, nor we have expertise to do all of the investigation. Yes, this is something that we need to work out.
So what is the process as you envision it once you're notified?
Once we notify, as we do, we make our preliminary assessment. Number 1, is this something that we have the expertise to do? Number 2, do we have resources to do this type of investigation? And once we answer to that is yes, we try to coordinate with the department in terms of what is the best approach in doing that investigation. If we don't have the expertise, we just notify them that they can go ahead with their own investigation and let us know the result once it's completed.
And if there's some disagreement on whether or not it should be the controller's office or the departments that do the investigation, or do you have a process of getting a consensus on how that's done, or is it just the controller's call? How are you envisioning that?
Well, it is a working relation between controller and the departments. We work out the situation in terms of to make sure that the best approach is employed in doing that investigation. It's not like it always has to be the controller. Is a cooperation and coordination between 2 parties.
I think the other issue is the worst thing that could happen is make a notification and everybody stands down and nothing happens. And again, I don't think you can take, if you're responsible from a department standpoint, I just don't think you could ever ask them not to do their job.
I don't think the intention of this for them not to do their job. The intention is more on notification for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Peter Echeverria from the City Attorney's Office. You can sense from the questions and the discussion that there's a little bit of tension between the various departments or offices that might be involved in these investigations. And at the time that the ordinance was drafted, the one that's in place now, there was that kind of discussion and give and take. The final code section was very much a striking of a balance. Not that it can't be drafted differently at this point in time, given what we know now. But Ethics, for example, has roles that are unique to them and jurisdiction that's unique to them. Controller has broader the waste and the fraud area as well. The department management has their responsibilities, which can't be abrogated as well since they're under the charter. There was obviously an attempt to resolve those and also to require some communication. The requirement for monthly meetings was put in the ordinance. It was the council saying to the parties, you need to meet and discuss this and exchange the information. And I think that's worked well in allowing them to discuss what they have pending and who should be taking the lead, or and if they needed to transfer a matter. Because of that, when I first saw this proposal, I was involved in resolving some of those tensions and issues at the time that the ordinance was previously drafted. I thought that it would be wise to get those parties together again before you take action and make an actual recommendation. And so I think the suggestion for 30 or 45 days, I would suggest 45 days, just given the number of things that happen about this time of year, that it would be a good idea to do that and have the parties get together and come back to you with a recommendation if in fact one can be crafted, and if not, what the issues are.
Now, in your view, as it's written, would any departments be precluded from doing their own investigations?
Not as it's currently written. I think that their ability to investigate might be impacted with the recommendations as they currently exist. The recommendation in the motion.
So that would be one of the things, presumably, that
needs to be
everyone
talked
would be
about.
working on,
Right.
working out. I think there were some legal questions also. What the legal implications are of the changes that were suggested in the legislation.
And one of the concerns that was discussed when the ordinance was originally written was the impact that it might have on an investigation. For example, the police had a concern about that they weren't as involved as other parties, but they were involved somewhat. What would happen to the evidence, for example, that they might need if either the controller didn't handle it correctly, or the department didn't handle it correctly, or ethics didn't handle it correctly before it was turned over to LAPD in a matter that in fact involved criminal conduct? When it comes to discipline, I'm not a labor relations expert, but the ability to discipline someone might be affected by what is done prior to the department actually taking the appropriate actions. Those were the kinds of potential legal consequences, not necessarily legal in the sense of legal prohibitions as to what was being proposed, that I think need to be discussed and thought about.
Good. Any other questions for?
I think you hit on the head. I think the issue is that, and also whoever is going to investigate it, generally the department is more aware of MOU requirements, all of these things that are superimposed over an investigative process, and rarely do we have in departments the ability to book evidence if there is a need to. So I think all that has to be hashed out. And again, the last thing you'd want is to believe that ball has been handed off, and then everybody stands down and you find out 6 months later nothing happened.
Right.
Okay, we have one speaker slip from a member of the public, Arnold Schwartz.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Arnold Schwartz. That last point that was brought up, it's a matter of administrative disconnect. Until you address the transfer of information there, then there really is no sense in implementing a new policy, because if these gentlemen are concerned about it and they're going to be investigating, you can be sure that a counselor, legal counselor, will be aware of that and will question the chain of control of information. And all he needs to do is break one of those links and the charges will be dismissed. So it'll be an exercise in futility. Address those issues first before you decide you're going to change the policy. Forensic accountant, I'm just concerned about certain incidences. For example, the fiasco with the controller filing a lawsuit against the district attorney's office. And the fact that she went out and hired private counsel, and the council, city councils, objected by stating that in an interview, she said that it would be pro bono. But I don't know, I didn't hear anybody say that there was a conflict of interest counselor available to the controller's office because she felt she needed to hire outside counsel because she was filing a lawsuit against the city attorney. So if nobody said anything to her about that, she went out and spent city money to hire outside counsel. This is the kind of incident that needs to be addressed. Is there a forensic accountant to look in that? And just very quickly,
If you could wrap up,
the
please.
fiasco with the overtime for the DOT for the venues, the new policy, that needs to be looked into. Why did it take so long? The head of the DOT said she tried to get it agendized for a year and a half. Heard in the committee, heard in the council meeting that it was a 7 or 8 year process. Why, when the city is bleeding red ink, did it take so long to have that item agendized? Those are things that need to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you. And I suggest we continue this item for 45 days so the controller's office and the city attorney's office can meet to discuss the proposal further and deal with any potential issues arising out of this change. And if there's no objections, right, we're still on this item. So no objections to that motion. Then we have one more item, which is a public comment, again from Arnold Schwartz.
Thank you again, sir. Arnold Schwartz. I was only going to address actually one item, but another item came up in this meeting. It seems that in committees, the public is allowed to hear reports first from the committee, from the staffs that are presenting them, and then make public comment. But in council chambers, and I'd like to, my point is to review this process, but in council chambers, when reports are given by staff members, normally it's public comment that's heard first regarding the item on the agenda. It hasn't been heard in the committee. Then the staff gives a report, which does not allow the public for items that can be commented on to hear a report and comment on that report. Committee, I heard the committee report. I was able to come up here and make my public comment. In the council, more likely than not, I would have been given my public comment period and then heard the report. So I would not have been able to comment to the council. That's the difference. Number two, in the Transportation Committee, regarding a contract that had been, a request for a proposal that had been issued by the LADOT, there was supposedly an incident of administrative disconnect. And I use that term. What had happened is, I believe, that the department submitted requests to agendize that item, request for proposal in front of the committee when the committee chairman was no longer in office. And so the item wasn't acted on. Since this is a government efficiency department, that should be addressed. If a committee chair is vacated, then it would be by necessity, any reports need to A, be sent to the vice chair, when available, or submitted to the council for action to be taken, not just held or not bypassing the proper steps, because it was a request by the council to follow a certain procedure, and because
I ask you to wrap up again.
there was no, again, because there was no chairperson of that committee, there was no action taken on the report. That should be addressed. Government efficiency, again, just needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you.
But that's not an accurate assessment of what occurred. No, I'm just saying, it's not an accurate assessment of what occurred.
Okay. But if it should occur that way.
Then they call it a vice chair.
But the vice chair was, something happened where the report wasn't heard.
And we are adjourned. Thank you.